Well, let's leave Syria there for now. Interesting discussion from both of you. Just to remind listeners, you're listening to The World Today with me, Dee Sebastian. Well, now let's go to Russia, and renewed protests are due to be held in Moscow and other cities there following Vladimir Putin's victory in last weekend's presidential election. Authorities have given permission for up to 50,000 protesters to gather on one of central Moscow's large avenues. Our correspondent Richard Galpin is on that very street now, and he joins us live. Richard, so are people beginning to gather now? Hello, Richard. Hello, is Richard Galpin there? Richard Galpin is our producer in Moscow. We obviously can't hear him at the moment. We'll just have a quick chat with our panellists about what they think about Moscow a bit later in the programme. But another discussion that we've been having in the programme is age and ageing. Douglas, you did actually tell us your age in the previous hour. Do you want to tell us again?
I did. I'm 32, and I'm intending to go up year by year, not be one of those people who's 32 for some time.
And Amira Woods in Washington, I wouldn't dream of asking you, but
thank you kindly.
But and you and I,
terrible sexism
you and I are
going
keeping
on
very
there.
quiet on the subject. But that's been one of the themes on our programme: age and ageing. And of course, none of us care because we're all on radio. But we've been asking our BBC World Service Facebook page how you feel about middle age. These people on the streets of London had mixed views. Service Facebook page, how they view middle age. Is it a cause for concern or an opportunity to settle down and enjoy life at a slower pace? Linda Kelly says, I'm in that category. Financial deficiency means I cannot slow down and enjoy a slower pace. She says she'd love to, though. P.O. Clark, he's got a more philosophical take on the issue. He says, middle age is Buddhism, the habit of always thinking about the universal laws of life, as well as practising what we trust until a higher wisdom is given to us. Well, Amira Woods, you're in Washington for us. I think, like me, you've got 3 children. Your children probably think you're middle-aged now, don't they?
Oh, no, they think I'm old. There's nothing middle about it. They think I'm elderly, old, senior, however you may describe it, over the hill. I think for children, particularly with technology now, they are embracing technology in new and creative ways. And the test for them is really how you can keep up with technology. And as much as I try, and I do, it's never up to their standards. So that's a whole different category.
I have to say, this programme is going to give me a midlife crisis. Your contributor who said that they wanted to go to a slower pace. I mean, this isn't old age we're talking about. We're only talking about middle age. I didn't know this was when you were meant to go to a slower pace. It's terrifying.
Well, on that note, I think we'll rapidly bring our discussion about age to a close for now. Now let's go back to Russia, where there have been renewed protests, or there are to be renewed protests, and Moscow city authorities... Well, that was James Graff. Well, my guests on the programme today, Douglas Murray, he's here in London, and Amira Woods, you're in Washington, D.C. I suppose it's your election, Amira, so we should go to you first. What did you think about James Graff saying that Mitt Romney is not catching fire?
Absolutely right on point. That for whatever reason, the Republican base is not excited about Romney. Many say it's because, he's seen as distant, as remote, being a hedge fund manager in the age where people are critiquing the 1%. He is representative of the 1% for whatever reason. It could be his religious background. The Mormons, heavily criticized by the evangelicals here in the United States. He is not seen as connecting. So that is still a major issue. Ultimately, though, this election on the Republican side as well as on the Democratic side is making it very clear that a Supreme Court decision last year called Citizens United, which essentially allowed unfettered access of corporate interests, of financial backers into the electoral process, that this is reshaping the American electoral process completely overnight. So as a result...
So you're saying that whoever wins the Republican nomination will be the richest, is that what you mean?
Well, will be backed by the richest, will be in the race because they have rich backers that will continue to prop them up in the race. Many say that, Newt Gingrich may well have left the race long time ago, were it not for very wealthy backers, again, one or two individuals that give millions of dollars to his campaign and keep him there in spite of poor showings in the polls. So I think it is the process through which the electoral process is actually changing, being reshaped by big money. It's ultimately taking away the voice of ordinary voters in the electoral process, and I think that is going to be the story of this election this year.
Okay, well, let's bring Douglas in here. Douglas, we don't have that kind of financing here in the UK, do we?
No, and I always think I'm very glad that we don't. The interminable US election process and the appalling amounts of money that just get wasted, apart from anything else, on negative attack ads, which I think benefit nobody really in the end, just add to a public dissatisfaction with politics. These things are certainly not things to envy in the American process, much as there are many other things that one certainly would envy in the process. But just quickly, I mean, this thing, I think I don't agree with this language. This false and I think sort of unbearable populist misdirection of this talk about 1% and the 99%. I don't buy any of that. But the fact is that the people running for the presidency are all, Republican, Democrat, are all people who you would classify as being in the 1%. They all talk now about sort of anti-elitist rhetoric. It's extremely hard to find any person running for the US presidency who doesn't fit every single definition of elite, including Obama, of course. And the thing is, of course, Romney has a problem on his hands here. Everyone can see already that the Republican Party wasn't really serious about winning this presidential election. If they had have been, the Republicans would have put forward, people would have stepped forward who were serious players in it. Romney was a second-tier hopeful, and then behind him have come third-tier people. People like Ron Paul have managed to catch fire precisely because the Republican front-runners have been of such a low calibre.
So Douglas, who are the serious players then?
I think there are a set of people who could have stood at this election. Chris Christie, Mark Rubio, maybe.
Feel free to come in here,
Jeb Bush, and others. The point is simply that the people who the people who have come forward this time have not been the best people that the Republican Party.
I think right now
field.
the Republican Party is off message. We are at a moment where the economy is stupid, is the saying, right? Yeah. The economy is the critical issue that is of concern to the electorate here, and instead the Republicans are wanting to talk about, contraception,
sure,
alienating
that's
half
always,
the population.
That's always the temptation.
Absurd.
It's always the temptation of
there's
American
no way
elections.
You can win an election if you alienate women, including Republican women, because you don't want to allow them control over their bodies.
Sure, and this is always the problem, and the Democrats do it too, is that they get diverted in election races onto things they can do and should do nothing about, and ignore the things that they should do something about.
Well, the irony is...
The classic example here is with the economy. Of course, right. Obama is in an advantageous position there if jobs continue to pick up, however slightly, because he can say that that's his doing. In fact, of course, much of the stuff to do with the economy is far beyond the control of any single president.
OK, well, let's leave it there, and we'll find out soon enough later in the year. Thanks very much for that. But now we're going to move on to this sound I asked. Stop it at once, Rebecca. Rebecca, I'd like to bring in one of our guests, Douglas Murray, who's here with me in the studio. If I tell you that he's sitting in his chair as if he's about to spring out of it and go for a sprint, so I don't think he's a slow person at all.
I'm still simply filled with admiration for the BBC's transition from the Republican primaries to a slow car crash. It's too perfect.
And have you a question for Rebecca?
Well, yes. I mean, why when you do this, can you not do, as it were, a good film done at an ordinary pace as a way to slow people down? Because to my mind, part of the problem at the moment is just that anything people do, including a concert, including any classic film, seems now to be too slow for people's attention. We're so used to cutaways happening every couple of seconds. Couldn't you just show good films?
Well, I mean, I think we are showing good films. The point of the festival is to try and show work that isn't shown any other time of the year. So a lot of the films we're showing are undistributed, just aren't normally seen in cinemas year-round. For example, we have the Filipino director actually coming over to the UK for the first time ever, who's showing his film Melancholia, which is an 8-hour film today. And Lav talks about his work, not really in relation to its duration. For Lav, the duration is actually about a freedom, and a freedom to actually make his work and to kind of tell the stories of the people of the Philippines.
And can I put in a plea? I'll come next time if you can show Napoleon, the 8-hour version.
Okay, that's a deal.
And let's bring in Amira. And that was Nadia. She was talking to us on Thursday. Well, Amira Woods is one of my guests. She's of the think tank Foreign Policy in Focus, and she was listening to that in Washington, D.C. Amira, one of the reasons we wanted to speak to a woman in particular on Thursday was because it was International Women's Day. That was a pretty harrowing listen, wasn't it? We don't often hear from women in Syria.
Well, it was quite gripping, and I think we have to thank Nadia for her courage to state so forcefully her views. I think, and we have seen, it's not only Syria, it's, Bosnia, we're on the anniversary of that horrific war where women were also brutally raped, sexual violence. It's many, many places. But I think what we have to recognize, particularly with Syria, is, that what Kofi Annan said was so true. Solutions have to come from within. Military interventions can create further problems. The lessons of Libya, I think, have to be acknowledged. It's just this week that the UN came out with a report really indicting NATO and NATO's response. Again, many can view these reports and really critique them. But ultimately, we have to recognize that the military interventions come with very, very serious implications in terms of civilians and the treatment of civilians during the crisis, but also the aftermath. And when there are political divisions within the opposition, as there are in Syria, I think it's even more cause for caution, for continuous pressure on a diplomatic solution that will bring long-lasting peace so that the Nadias out there can have a true resolution to the crisis that they're facing.
Well, indeed. Douglas, Nadia, though, was calling very forcefully for military intervention. What's your take on that?
I certainly think it's something that should be considered and should be made plain to the Assad regime is on the table. Of course, military intervention always comes with a price, and I think to that extent nobody should be naive about calling for it, but it's clear that she is not naive, and nor many of the others who are increasingly saying that at the very least, for instance, a no-fly zone could be implemented by international forces. It would require a fairly substantial commitment by probably this country among others, by Britain among others, but that if a no-fly zone was put in place, the use by the Assad regime, for instance, helicopter gunships to murder civilians would be severely limited. But I say that again with some caution, because even if you do that, even if you were to introduce a no-fly zone and protected regions, which would be, I think, the ideal to begin the process of helping those who are being suppressed by Assad's forces, even if you do that, the fact is that mission creep is inevitable, because once you're policing a no-fly zone, you're going to shoot something down.
Well, a no-fly zone is military.
Exactly, and eventually down the point from that, we'd be looking at regime change. I think it's very obvious that regime change should be an objective in Syria, should have been for a long time, and that we're seeing daily the results of an extraordinary naivety around the world and in the region about the nature of Assad and his regime. And I think it's worth remembering as well, you mentioned International Women's Day. It's only just over a year ago that Vogue magazine ran an infamous profile of Mrs. Assad called The Rose of the Desert, talking about the charm of this woman, the charm of the Assads, and so on. And the fact is that people for many years wanted to be hoodwinked by Assad. He is what he always has been. He is what his father was. He's a brutal dictator who's now reminding the world of that. And either we do something about it, or we agree that there is nothing to be done and we simply watch. But both of those things will have consequences.
Right. Well, let me just bring Amira in here. Amira, pretty strong words from Douglas, but briefly, you set a lot of store by Kofi Annan and his mission.
Well, I think, he's got now the mandate of both the United Nations and the Arab League. I think it is a chance to bring about a resolution to this crisis that is lasting. I think we have to recognize that, what this is about is an uprising of people demanding change, a revolution, right? And I think, how does the international community support people's efforts to bring about that change from within? I think we have to explore all efforts on the diplomatic end to try to stand in solidarity at critical moments. And we are at a testing point now for the international community in Syria.
But this is a testing point for the Assad regime. I mean, the Assad regime will only be able to stay in place if there is some kind of compromise at this stage, if it can continue the killing for some time, completely subjugate the country again, and stay in power. And that